the occupation of Iraq. David Kilcullen, senior counterinsurgency advisor to General David Petraeus, and other authors on the war. From the 2007 New Yorker Festival, this is about an hour, 40 minutes.
I might as well take these off since I can't see you in the harshness of the lights. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Welcome to the 33rd annual Iraq panel at the New Yorker Festival. This is actually my third Iraq panel, and I think I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. I want to extend a special welcome to my 3-week-old son, Charlie, who's here for his first Iraq panel tonight. He might have an opinion or two to express as we go on this evening. I think we have a dream panel tonight. There is more expertise on this stage than I have ever sat with in talking about Iraq, and I'm going to introduce them. David already told you a bit about John Lee Anderson at the right. John Lee is my colleague as a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's the author of a biography of Che Guevara and 3 books of reportage based on his travels in war zones: Guerrillas, Journeys in the Insurgent World, The Lion's Grave, Dispatches from Afghanistan, and The Fall of Baghdad. He's reported extensively, I mean truly exhaustively, from the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa, and he's covered Iraq before, during, and after the American invasion. He has just returned from his umpteenth trip there. John Lee Anderson. Phoebe Marr is a historian of the Middle East and one of the world's foremost experts on the politics and history of Iraq. She's been a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a senior fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, and a research professor at the National Defense University. She's the author of the standard work, The Modern History of Iraq, which every journalist I know who goes to Iraq reads, and most recently of a monograph called Iraq's New Political Map, which I'm sure we'll hear about tonight. To my left is Phoebe Marr. To my immediate left is Ali Allawi. He was born in Baghdad and educated in Britain and the United States. He's been a banker, a hedge fund manager, a senior associate at St. Antony's College, Oxford, a member of the Iraqi opposition in exile, and following his return to Iraq in 2003, he was the Minister of Trade and of Defense on the Iraqi Governing Council and the Minister of Finance in the government of Prime Minister Ibrahim Jafari in 2005 and 2006. He's also the author of the new book, The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace, which is the first book by a high-level member of the post-Saddam Iraqi government. Ali Allawi. And David Kilcullen is a lieutenant colonel in the Australian Army Reserve and a doctorate in anthropology. He's focused in both his official and his academic capacities on insurgency and counterinsurgency in Muslim societies, especially Indonesia. And he's published a number of articles in strategy journals. And more recently, he was the chief counterterrorism strategist in the U.S. State Department, a contributor to the Pentagon's Quadrennial Defense Review, and earlier this year, a senior counterinsurgency advisor to General Petraeus in Iraq. David Kilcullen. We will have a conversation among the 5 of us for about an hour, and then we'll bring you into the conversation for the last half hour. There will be 3 microphones all on this level, so if you're upstairs, you'll need to come downstairs to ask a question. But let's start with where is Iraq now? What trends do you see in motion? Iraq changes so quickly that I, who haven't been there since January, feel that I've probably missed 3 or 4 new directions, which we're always a little late in finding out about, we who are outsiders. But John Lee, you've just come back from your umpteenth trip. Where is Iraq? What struck you on this trip, perhaps, that was different from before?
Yeah, it's impressionistic. I'm still absorbing the experience. I was only in Baghdad, but moving around a fair bit. I mixed it up this time. I was both a bit on my own and also embedded with the U.S. Army. I came away without the feeling that I've always come away with from Iraq this time, which was a sinking feeling that new carnage, with a greater ever dimension was about to occur. And in part, it's because of the surge. It seemed to me, the last time I was there, around the same time as you, where the city was completely out of control. Militias were moving across the city in broad daylight, doing mass kidnappings, murders. And there were the politicians and the U.S. Embassy in the Green Zone, evidently incapable of doing anything to prevent it. The security situation alone mandated beat cops on the street for some time, and so the 30-odd thousand men they poured into that place has had an effect. The killings down, but the tension levels are still very great. There is still ethnic cleansing, sectarian, tit-for-tat killing going on in places. There are districts where the surge has not even reached and which are regarded as essentially out of control still. Quote unquote, we don't have the men to go there yet. The areas I was in were a combination of the two. And where there is a kind of peace, it's now being policed by people who were, until very recently, hostile to the American occupation, cooperative with Al-Qaeda in the case of one district I was in northwest Baghdad, Ghazaliyah, which is in essence the gateway between Baghdad and Anbar, Fallujah, Abu Ghraib. And it's a walled district now, and it's, in essence, the security formula seems to be, in addition to more troops on the ground, these joint, we're seeing more of a transition in the sense that they're standing up Iraqis. They're fast-tracking some of these local people whose pasts are not entirely investigated to become police. It's an emergency situation, and they're walling them off, in essence, from their neighbors. So there's a kind of limbo, I would say. I came away with a feeling that the place is in a kind of plateau, a limbo that's difficult to, it's difficult to look in a crystal ball and say what's going to happen next. One thing I did also pick up is that the language, the rhetoric amongst the military people I was with, and also from Iraqis, was less about Al-Qaeda as an imminent threat, which gave Iraq the kind of gruesome edge that it had previously had. They're still capable of pulling off car bombings and some terrible killings. But the talk of counterinsurgency has moved towards the Shiite militia, Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army. And, I suspect, I feel that there is a kind of coming battle there. And, of course, the backdrop to that is also the larger confrontation with Iran. So it becomes very complex. You can't look at Iraq or even its security situation in isolation now, given that the whole is part of a larger confrontation and a regional one as well. So,
Phoebe, how do you see Iraq's politics at this moment? From Washington, from the U.S., it seems as if it's completely dysfunctional. The central government is incapable of either coming to accommodation among the factions or providing minimal services to the people. Is that an accurate view of Iraqi politics today? Are there other things going on that we should know about?
Well, there's probably a great deal that is going on that we should know about, but I would like to echo what John says. One cannot talk about Iraq and its politics with any degree of certitude, because we, that is certainly the Westerners, probably even the government, so-called itself, can't get out of the green zone, out and around, actually to understand what's going on. So it's very uncertain. But certainly from Washington, we paint this in broad brushes of ethnic and sectarian differences and so on. Iraq is much more complex than that. Indeed, to speak about the government, one has to speak in very broad brush tones, because I'm not sure how much of a government there is. I would say three things. I've made a point of writing about the current leaders, mainly because these are the few people that one can get at and one can talk to. There are several things one can say about it. There's been such discontinuity in leadership that they're relatively, for the most part, inexperienced, although some of them are acquiring more experience. Many of them are still exiles, although this time, instead of being Western exiles, people who were rooted in the West, many of them have spent their exile in the Middle East and have much more of a Middle Eastern background and environment, some in Iran, some in Damascus. Including Maliki himself. And others who may or may not speak good English, but that isn't the point. Their ability to communicate with us is less than it should be. Or that should be, I wouldn't say it should be, but less than we would like. The third thing I think we have to understand, however, is this is not so much about ethnic and sectarian politics as it is people who are in opposition to the Saddam regime in one group, one party or another, and a conflict with people who certainly were either part of the old regime and no longer are there, or who had some connection with it, and so on. And this is metamorphosized into a Shia-Sunni conflict, but it isn't really. And last but not least, what I think we have to understand is that there is a struggle for power going on at the grassroots and certainly within the government itself that concerns political parties, political leaders. And these are the main actors, certainly within the government. But last but not least, the question is, how much contact does the government actually have with localities, with people on the ground? One can say that the Kurdish political parties certainly are more deeply rooted and do have some contact, but I would question the kind of contact that the people in the government sitting in the green zone have with what's going on in Amara, what's going on in Basra, what's going on in Anbar. All politics is local. And the kind of, I think the decisive thing in terms of moving this ahead in one direction or another is what is going to happen on the ground with a great diversity and complexity of people. One of the things that's interesting, of course, is the emergence of pushback against Al-Qaeda and other forces in Anbar, and this is local. This was, these were groups who emerged on their own, and a feeling in Washington that we are now conducting tribal politics. This is the latest talk, that we're going to work with tribes here, there, and the other place. But in Washington, there are always these catchphrases. We're going to work with tribes. We're going to work with this group and that. That's right.
Bottom up these days. Yep.
But in fact, it's very complex. A myriad of different local players, and much of this struggle for power, and it is a struggle for power, is going to take place on the ground. And predicting the direction in which it's going to go, I think we should be very modest about.
Well, we'll get back to the so-called Sunni awakening and tribal politics. But Ali, you were in the government. You have a lot of friends and colleagues who are still in the government. Does the Green Zone seem as cut off as the old American Occupation Authority used to those of us who remember back then? Is it irrelevant increasingly to what's happening around the country? What's your sense?
Well, I would say yes and no, in the sense that the I mean, there's no doubt that it is obviously physically isolated from the rest of the country, and it's very difficult for people to move outside of the green zone freely. I mean, there's a very serious level of risk involved in leaving that area. But at the same time, most of the politicians inside the green zone, especially those who are connected to the principal political parties, do have roots and links and their agents scattered throughout the country. So it's not really as isolated as people would like to think. Nevertheless, I think I'd like to pick up on what John Lee said, and that is, we are, I believe, at the end of one cycle in this Iraq crisis. The Iraq crisis is hardly over. This cycle, which started on April the 9th, 2003, is now reaching an end. And in the end of this cycle, there are certain results that have taken place. One of them is that there is a political class that is now ensconced inside the green zone that really constitutes the some governing authorities of the country. And that class arose primarily as a result of a series of elections that took place towards the end and the beginning of 2005. Now, the elections of 2005 were rooted in a particular highly charged political environment of that period, in which people voted for their identities. So you had a reflection of these identities inside the some constitutional assembly, of which I was a member, and then subsequently in the government.
But some people have said the election was a census. We found out how many Shia, Sunnis, and Kurds there are in Iraq by the election.
Yes, it's true. I mean, it did take on that. There are very, very few people in the elections of 2005 who did not vote as a result of their ethnic or sectarian identities. So you have a political class that is a reflection of the events of 2005. Many things have happened since that time. My own sense is that the cycle that has ended has created a culture that is becoming more and more distanced from the real issues that are being faced by the rank and file, the ordinary people of the country. And I think at that point we have to step back and see, well, what are the elements of the next cycle? And here I think we're getting into terra incognita. All I can say is that there are very powerful impulses that are affecting a large number of people in Iraq. There's a great deal of resentment, bitterness, and anger as to what has happened, not only since the invasion and occupation, but also in terms of the recent history of the country. In the last 25 or 30 years, the population of Iraq, the people of Iraq, went through enormous hardships. We're talking about war, insurrection, civil war, sanctions, and now invasion and occupation, with a political culture that has emerged that is to some extent not rooted in the history of the country. And I think as stability interpreted as the cowing or the elimination of the threat from Al-Qaeda increases, and I think Al-Qaeda to a very large extent is no longer the scale of threat it was, say, 6 months or 12 months ago. We're now getting into a different landscape, and that landscape, I think, will have many, many surprises that are going to burst upon us. One of the issues, I think, is that the presence of the US there is also an element, a very important element, that's affecting domestic Iraqi politics and the relationship between the various political groups to the United States and to the ongoing role of the United States post any stable and secure, militarily secure situation in Iraq is also an issue that has not yet been faced by the Iraqi political class. And if you go back into history, the presence of the British after the 1920s in one form or another, in the form of bases or in the perception that they controlled domestic politics, was a thorn in the flesh of the political culture of the country and continued to be a cause of instability. How these parties and these new forces are going to align themselves to the ongoing commitment, political commitment of the United States, is something that has to be reckoned with in the future.
So the first cycle, April 2003 until the last set of elections, created the new Iraqi political class, and this cycle is, in a sense, a reaction against that political class that may not be as easily defined along sectarian and ethnic lines as those elections were? Is that?
I think so. I mean, because this political class has very little to say about the burning issues of Iraq. First of all, we have about 2 million people who are refugees now outside of the country, far more than what happened in the days of Saddam. At the same time, we have nearly 2 million people who are internally displaced. Most of these people, by my reckoning, are not likely to go back to their places of residence. To some extent, the ethnic and sectarian, it has been mainly sectarian rather than ethnic cleansing, although we're at the beginning, I think, of an ethnic cleansing of sort in the Arab Kurdish areas, especially in the Kirkuk area. These things have not been part of Iraq's political culture. And the political leaders do not address these issues. They don't address the issues that affect people's daily lives, the issues of daily existence, the hardships that people face.
Okay, we'll get to those hardships. But Dave, you spent quite a bit of time in Iraq earlier this year. You've been watching it carefully since then. Have we turned a corner in the insurgency? Have we turned a corner on Al-Qaeda? Is the surge working? What's your sense of where the military, and if you want, the political situation is today?
I'm just going to talk for a second so everybody can cue into my accent. Got it? All right. I actually
it's an
think
advantage for you, and
right.
you should use it while you can.
When I do start talking, I have to kind of let people just think for a second, and they go, I get it now. Actually, I think turning the corner is perhaps not the best way to describe the situation. I actually like better the idea of cycles. And I think we've seen a number of cycles in the security situation since 2003. The one that I date as the most decisive to date, or the event that I believe transformed the environment the most dramatically, was the Samara bombing on the 22nd of February last year. And you remember you and I were at a conference in Leavenworth trying to get the new counterinsurgency manual and put it together. And you remember I left the conference a day early and flew straight to Baghdad, because that day was the day of the Samara bombing. And 48 hours later, I was on the ground in Baghdad, and all the people we were talking to then were saying, this changes everything. We have moved from where we were last year to a completely different sort of terms of conflict on the ground. Now, I think that's a slight overstatement. But in fact, I think it's true to say that the war did change its character substantially at the start of last year. And most of last year we saw this very destructive cycle of just tearing apart the social fabric of particularly Baghdad and the belts around Baghdad. And as John Lee said, places are walled off. It's sort of a Mad Max environment out there, with people self-protecting neighbourhoods in a sort of anarchic and dangerous situation. That was last year. What we've done with the surge is not so much bring extra troops in. The troops were a tool. What we've done is we've changed our approach from fundamentally focusing on the enemy and trying to, if you like, find the needle in the haystack. And we've realised that actually we're doing so much damage to the haystack in the process of looking for the needle that it's actually not getting us anywhere. And so we've decided to focus instead on securing the population. That, I think, is the new kind of organising principle of what we're trying to do. Previously we would move in and sort of swat the population out of the way and say, let us get at the enemy, or we're bringing in the Iraqi government. Now we turn up and we say, what are the facts on the ground? Who's in charge in this district? And we try and partner with the population in order to create a commonality of interest across sectarian lines and also between the government and the people against extremists. And that's kind of the similarity between what's happening in Anbar, what's happening in Baghdad, what's happening in the belts, all the places where you can see I think a very substantial improvement in the security situation. It's because we've effectively partnered with the population. And of course that takes different forms depending on whether you're looking at tribal groups or local districts or so on. Which gets to Phoebe's point, is where is the government in that? Where's the Iraqi government in that process? And I think that's the key issue going forward, is how we bring the Iraqi government into that process in an effective way. I'm not talking about the Maliki cabinet here, I'm talking about the government, the actual structure of government that brings services to people and ties people to the state of Iraq. And, I'm sure Ali has a view on this, but in America, the words country, nation, and state mean basically the same thing, all right? It wasn't always the case. Think about the Civil War. But in Iraq, there's an Iraqi state, there's the Iraqi sort of national identity, and then there's the territory of Iraq, and they're not always the same. I mean, the Kurds, I would suggest, in the north, throughout most of their history, have been supporters of neither the Iraqi state nor really the Iraqi national identity. The Shia in the south, strong supporters of Iraqi national identity, but at times alienated from the state. And the Sunnis, owned the state for a while there, and now they don't own it anymore, so there's a degree of rejection of the current environment. And to their view, they are the nation. So there's a sort of very different set of paradigms that people are applying depending on which part of the Iraqi society they're from. So what that tells me is this is not an engineering project, right? Putting the security measures in place to create the environment in which people are capable of reaching an agreement doesn't necessarily mean they're going to reach the agreement. There's alchemy involved in this politics. And I think we all recognise that in US domestic politics. Why would Iraqi politics be any different? So I think we've created, the military right now is holding the ring, if you like, to allow a debate to move off, head cutting into figuring out where we want Iraq to go. Whether that happens or not is really up to the Iraqis, and then you get down to the question of which Iraqis are you talking about? Are you talking about the somewhat disconnected political class in the Green Zone? Are you talking about people who have strong roots in different regions? Are you talking about the religious political parties? Are you talking about the tribal leaders? And you get a different answer depending on which group you're looking at.
Right. John Lee, did you feel that when you were with the soldiers in Baghdad this time and you were embedded for part of your trip, that it seemed different? You've probably embedded maybe every few months for the entire war, every 6 months, whatever. You've had a chance to watch the American military on a very difficult learning curve for 4 years. Do they talk the talk of Dave Kilcullen and David Petraeus? Do they talk about population protection? Do they seem to understand their mission in a new way?
There were a couple of impressive young captains that I met at that level, and I know that's where you've applied a lot of your work. At times it felt a little excruciating because it's something they've had to sort of cram it, and they're still getting their mouths around certain concepts, certain impressions. It's still a mixed bag, and it depends on which. It's very much personality led. A young, 29 or 28-year-old captain in charge of a district of people his personality and the way he approaches the population and the way he deals emotionally with the stresses of his tasks can create a marked difference in the way his units deal with the population. In a way, there was a sense of déjà vu. I went on a number of raids. An informant tells them that there's some bad guys in a house, and you go out at 12 at night. And it was the same distressing scenes in these cases. I don't know that they're avoidable, where, young men are, people are violently awakened by troops coming in the house. They're thrown on the floor. The mother, the wives crying, begging the Americans not to take them. In most of the cases, when I was on these raids, it was a case of a suspicion rather than they actually got the guy. These men were held for a few hours, in some cases overnight, and returned. But you always feel when you're witnessing things that damage is being done. It's a very oral call. And I was surprised to still be seeing that in these districts where, there's partnership going on. A kind of cluelessness in the case of some of the officers about how people would be affected by this. And simply not, closing a door so that the mother isn't witnessing the humiliation of her son. That son, according to most Iraqis I know, in my experience there, it almost mandates that he take some sort of revenge later if he's been humiliated, depending on how tribal his belonging to the culture. I saw one soldier lose it, be overly aggressive with people. I saw others that were very sensitive, trying to learn Arabic, trying to get it right. It's still a mixed bag. It's still early days. I think I saw some signs of the kind of thing that you've been talking about. The brigade that I was with had an anthropologist who's trying to figure out, kind of like reading the tea leaves around the Khadimiyya Mosque, the Shiite area. It's a bit like a 19th century expedition almost. We must understand what's in this walled city. We don't know, There's a sense of that. I suppose I'm being a little facetious, but one is always frustrated that it's not happening. It didn't happen more quickly. That there are still clueless people who have a lot of clout and can adversely affect the situation. That there aren't more really bright people on the ground. Some are, some aren't.
I guess, Dave, the question that raises is whether a counterinsurgency manual can change the way the American military fights this very difficult fight.
The manual's a book, right? Books can change the world. I don't think anyone has expected that this one's going to change the situation in Iraq on the ground overnight. I think, but it's much more. This is not about what's written in some book or something that you download. It's about relationships that people build up on the ground. And I take John Lee's point, and we have to oppose some of our anecdotal evidence to some of the trend evidence as well here. And as you know, last year, an average night in Baghdad, 120 to 150 people were getting killed. This year, a bad night is 10. Sometimes we go through a night with nobody. So we, on a conservative estimate, are saving 100 to 150 Iraqi lives a night. So that is something, okay? It's not perfection, but you know what? A good way to annoy people is to kill them and kill their relatives. So I think there is a difference here. The other point I'd say is it's easy to laugh at these walled compounds, but again, I think you guys know yourselves. We didn't bring the walls. The Iraqis built them themselves last year when there was anarchy, and they basically created these self-defending districts with these walls of 44-gallon, petrol drums and bricks and all that kind of stuff. What's happened here is when we arrived with a different approach, which was to partner with the population, we said, let's look at the defences of your district and let's make it more secure. Let's enrol some of your local people to stop the wrong people coming into your district. Let's identify what your primary needs are and create a method of dealing with them, and let's bring the government to you. And the embedded provincial reconstruction teams are the other key element of the surge, the civilian surge. Last year, Baghdad PRT, on average, they got out for about 2 hours a week to see people that they dealt with. So imagine that, you're mentoring somebody and you get to see them 2 hours a week. I mean, that's not a relationship, it's like piano lessons, right? With the embedded PRT, we now have people out sort of 40, 50 hours a week or continuously in the field. So the contact between the civilian agencies of government and the population is much greater. But you know what? We've had 5 years of just horrendous, tragic violence, and it's not going to be fixed in 6 months. So like you said at the start, George, we haven't turned a corner exactly. I think what we've done is we've taken an enterprise that was struggling, where there was just this increasing chaos and violence in Iraq, and we've brought it back to a higher level of stability. And that's about as much as I think we can expect.
Go ahead.
If I could raise an issue here. I get the sense, too, that we're at a sort of, not a turning point, but a sort of a level and perhaps a new stage. But I wonder if Americans realize the amount of of disruption that's been done to Iraqi society. For one thing, we've had not only huge demographic changes inside Iraq, but we have what is commonly thought to be something close to 2 million middle-class people and others, maybe not 2 million middle class, but a lot of people who have left Iraq, and a lot of separation. Maybe, in fact, it's reached a point where there just can't be much more. I'd also like to mention this middle class business, because in fact, not simply after our occupation, but even under Saddam, Iraq has lost its middle class. This has to be the basis of government, of competence, and so on. And from my perspective, almost a whole new educated middle class is going to have to be created. I do agree with Ali that many of the people who have left are probably, alas, not going to return. So I always tell people that there have been two revolutions in Iraq. One is not only a revolution in a change of government, a destruction of a government that was a military and so on, and even perhaps a destruction of the state. Recuperation from this is going to be, absolutely horrendous. So I wonder if we're not seeing this new stage because of exhaustion, because so much disruption and change has already taken place. And last but not least, it's the issue, I think, is less whether the Americans are going to be able to do this. I wonder myself how in the world this group of people who doesn't speak the local language, who's just now learning the local culture, can in fact engineer change. This is going to have to come from Iraqis and a group of people who are just emerging from cataclysmic change.
Speaking of coming from Iraqis, Dave mentioned the walls that are going up around neighborhoods in Baghdad. Yes, those neighborhoods began the process, but when the wall is built by the American military, it seems to engender a backlash, a sense that America is cutting off Iraqis from each other for whatever nefarious reasons. But let me just finish my question to Phoebe. Is the same thing true of what the Senate just did last week? Last week, the Senate voted 75 to 23, essentially to get rid of the Bush administration's political strategy, which we all ought to know about, but very few of us do. It's a remarkable thing that happened. And instead to embrace what's come to be known as the Biden-Gelb plan, which is 3 or however many, but probably 3, autonomous regions with a radical form of federalism. Immediately in Baghdad, the politicians united for the first time around their opposition to this plan. America is trying to carve up Iraq. What's your feeling about what some Americans think of as the only solution, the only way out to accept reality and divide Iraq into 3?
Well, first of all, I think that was almost a stealth resolution. While the Gelb-Biden plan has been around for some time, it's known as soft petition. There will be some kind of a very weak central government, and then regions, the Kurdish region, a so-called Shia region, the so-called Sunni region, will be the federal regions. The resolution itself does not specify this. Right. It's much vaguer. You could vote for that and then later say you really didn't vote to divide Iraq. But the debate... You
were for it before you were against it.
Yeah, you were for it, whatever, that's right, whatever. But the debate, such as it was, that took place, I did read in the Senate, made pretty clear that that's what people have in mind. I think there are two issues here. First of all, this has to be up to the Iraqis. Any attempt by the United States to quote-unquote solve this problem by assuring that you're going to freeze these ethnic and sectarian divisions, particularly the sectarian divisions, I think is a formula for disaster. I doubt very much the Iraqis may do that to themselves, but whatever it is, it's going to have to be the Iraqis who decide this. And this picks up with something that Dave said. Although it looks like there's a Kurdish region, which perhaps has a little more to it because of the language issue, and a Shia region and a Sunni region, these regions these divisions are not homogeneous. In fact, the Shia themselves are divided at least into two main groupings. Now, you mentioned the Jaish al-Mahdi, the more middle-class Supreme Council Party, and myriad different groups and political leaders. And the so-called Sunni region is so fractured, it's not clear who, in fact, could speak for them. So we really have to get over these kinds of divisions.
So
even the Kurdish region has its
So we'd be
divisions.
lucky to have Bosnia. There will be no Dayton Accords.
Let me just make one point about that petition plan. Even the people who want the petition plan agree that there has to be a central government which does two minor things. Divides up the oil resources, the major resource in the country, and second of all, protects the borders. And I would again say that if you could get a government strong enough to do that in Baghdad, the United States could get out tomorrow.
Ali, is there a constituency for soft partition in Iraq, or is this just an American idea that's going to go nowhere?
No, I think on the contrary, it's an idea that's been going on for some time. It's not something that was sprung upon an unsuspecting public. The Biden resolution, if you look at it very carefully, is really not much different from what is already inside the Constitution. I mean, I'm not calling for any kind of partition, but the reality of the matter is that if you take the Kurdish area out, the country is already a confederation between an Arab Iraq and a Kurdish semi-state up north. So it's not really that far-fetched. What we're really talking about now, the crisis in Iraq, is not so much the role of the Kurds or their semi-independent state that they have, which is basically has been conceded by all the parties and major political groups. The main issue is what are you going to do with the Arab side of Iraq, and whether the sectarian wars or conflicts of the last few years added to the sectarian biases that always existed in the Iraqi state, but not necessarily to the point where it created these kinds of irreconcilable differences between the communities. Whether these are enough to form the basis of another federal arrangement between the Arabs of Iraq. The main political party, Syrio, it's now called the Supreme Islamic Council, that propounded the idea of mainly a Shia mini-state in the south, or a Shia region in the south, has been quite reticent about speaking out against the Biden resolution. So the rest of the political class that rose up in outrage against it are either those who have a vested interest in maintaining their control over the Iraqi state, or those who see themselves as it were, a government in waiting, especially the secular parties. So I think the jury is still out whether this is a workable proposition or not. My own feeling is that it is unlikely to end up in 3 different states, simply because the world would not recognize the component parts. But at the same time, I think the politics of the country are so fragmented now, and regionalized, provincialized, tribalized, partly due to the American security strategy over the last few months, that it's very difficult to see how the central state can reassert its authority over the Arab side of Iraq.
I guess by the American security strategy, you mean, in part at least, partnering with tribal and local militias in Anbar province, for example. Dave, you saw that up close, you've written about it. Is the Sunni awakening a formula to end the civil war, or is it a long-term intensification of the civil war? Are we ensuring that eventually we will have armed both sides of a civil war, or are we giving a chance to local political forces that could come to an accommodation with each other?
Let me just make a framing comment, and then I think it's important to realize that this is not happening just in Anbar. It's happening in about 45% of the country. It's a very large-scale phenomenon, but it's different in different places. Okay, it's not the same. Like, for example, in Amaria in Baghdad, on the 2nd of June was the period when the Amaria population turned against Al-Qaeda. They were led by 3 Sunni imams of local mosques and a couple of local population key figures. There wasn't a tribal component to that. In Anbar, it is tribal, but tribal politics is complicated. It's the Sopranos up there, and in the south, there's a whole different issue going on in terms of the way that the different Shia political parties play into that process. So it's different in different places, but it is a very widespread phenomenon. I'd rather not talk about the tribal awakening. I'd rather talk about how populations in different parts of the country are rejecting some of the more violent extremist groups, not necessarily out of a desire to be part of a unified democratic Iraq, but out of self-interest. And I think self-interest is actually the organising principle here. The reason that the tribes turned against al-Qaeda, there are complex issues involved, but it was fundamentally self-interest. They felt that al-Qaeda was leading them on a path to destruction, that they would never be able to coexist with the realities of the new Iraqi state while they were under the thumb of al-Qaeda. They felt that al-Qaeda was exploiting them. All of those things were true, and so they turned against al-Qaeda. In Nasiriyah in June, Shia tribal leaders came to us and said, we saw what the tribes got in Anbar, we want what they're getting, we're going to turn as well. And we said, well, they turned against al-Qaeda, who are you turning against? And they're like, well, Jaish al-Mahdi, so it's a self-interest thing, right? It's not political. That's just to frame it. I think it could go in two different directions. Let me paint them for you. One possibility is that we end up with a situation that looks a little bit like Lebanon after the Taif Accords, okay, where we have different components within Iraqi society that are perhaps communitarian-based, that are self-protecting, and that creates an internal balance of power, where one group knows that it can't kill or overthrow another, and consequently that gives people pause and they sit back. There's a fundamental difference between what al-Qaeda was doing in Anbar, for example, which was all directed against attacking the social fabric of Iraq, and what the tribal, or what we call concerned citizens groups, the local security forces are doing with the police. They're protecting their own community. They're not attacking the other guy. That's the fundamental difference. And so it's possible that you might end up with this balance where people realise there's kind of a mutual balance where people say, well, I can't win necessarily if I take on the other sectarian group. That's one possibility. The other possibility is you just end up with a better armed civil war when we leave. Now, there's a couple of myths kicking around here which are worth talking about. One is we haven't actually armed these tribes. Okay? I mean, if only Iraq was so secure that they needed us to give them weapons, right?
But haven't we funded them? We've paid off sheikhs, we've paid off local leaders.
What has happened is that we have gone into areas and done essentially a negotiation and reconciliation process with local community leaders, identified what their needs and wants are and how we can work together, and crafted a series of local agreements which bring them onto the street to protect their own area. Now, in the first stage, they're unarmed and they're out there just running checkpoints, sort of like nightclub bouncers. What are you doing here? You're not from this district. At a later stage, they do carry weapons and they act as members of the local police force. But to get to that stage, they've got to take an oath of allegiance to the Iraqi government. They have to have their biometric data taken. We record the weapon serial number. We know where they live. There's all kinds of controls involved. It's not just guys running around with guns, okay? So there's a whole process involved in bringing these people closer to the Iraqi government.
But that's the ultimate question. Are we simply creating stronger local forces which are sectarian in identity, or is there some bridge to the central government?
It gets us back to Ali's point. What we have done here is we've taken a terminal patient, well, not terminal, a critically, acutely injured patient, and tried to stabilise the situation. Mm-hmm. You can think of those walls that we put up in Baghdad as sort of like an urban tourniquet, trying to just staunch the flow of massive bloodletting that had been happening. And if you leave a tourniquet on too long, the limb drops off, right? So there's a time when you have to relax it, and that's when the political factors of political leadership and the political climate in Iraq becomes decisive. We can't say who's going to win the election in this country next year. I don't think we should try and say what that political process is going to be like.
Ali, there's an idea in this country. Let's talk a bit about American policy. There's an idea, Senator Levin has said it numerous times, that as long as the Iraqi leaders know that we're there, they're not going to get their act together. So we have to have a timeline for withdrawal in order to pressure them to come to the difficult decisions on oil, revenue sharing on debathification, on elections, that they have been unable to come to. Is that your sense, that if we just tell them we're leaving, there will be some movement in Baghdad?
I think yes, definitely. I mean, in spite of all the apparent risks that the United States might incur by leaving this potential security vacuum, I think the presence of the US troops there is in fact strengthening a government, or strengthening those forces who are in charge of a government, in order to cement their own narrow interests. And as long as the United States is seen to be the resolver of all the major differences and one that's going to enforce security and stability, it's basically just empowering these people to continue in their own political games. I think also in terms of Iraq's own, frankly, honor and dignity, you cannot continue to be in an occupied state for an indefinite period of time. And Iraq is an occupied country, in spite of the forms in which this occupation appears to grant sovereignty to the country. Iraq is not a sovereign country. There are many, many cases and instances that you can see it's not. Recently, for example, the United States arrested an Iranian businessman in the Kurdistan area. The president of the country, Jalal Talabani, requested specifically that he be released, and his request was ignored. A year ago, Brahim Jafari was elected the nominee of the major governing party, the United Iraqi Alliance, and his nomination as prime minister was basically vetoed by the United States. There are a huge array of ways in which Iraq's sovereignty is degraded by the continuing presence of a very large foreign force.
Blackwater is a pretty good example.
Blackwater is another example. I mean, this has been going on. It's also to do with the way that this war is basically a prototype of future wars to come. A large number of formerly combat troops, their functions are taken over by private contractors. If you add the two together, probably the military presence in Iraq exceeds 300,000 people, which brings it nearly up to Vietnam levels. So the whole thing is seen by Iraqis really that we've turned into a laboratory for all kinds of postmodern experiments in social engineering and nation building and so on. And it's about time that we took the reins of true sovereignty in our hands. And there's no way I think this can continue from an Iraqi point of view, as long as there are a large number of American troops there who are there for an indeterminate period with indeterminate goals, frankly, at the end of the day.
And you have said that you don't think the departure of American troops is going to bring about the apocalypse in Iraq.
No, I don't think so. I think what will happen is that these various groups that David was referring to, they would coalesce themselves in different arrangements and reach some form of an unstable equilibrium between them, with the central government being more powerful than all of them individually, simply because there's access to large amounts of oil revenue.
John Lee, yeah.
There seems to be an intention, however, if the security situation improves to a sufficient degree that they can, to draw down American troop levels to 30,000, 40,000, and to establish a more or less permanent a la Korean Peninsula presence in these several large, some call them super bases, which presumably would also bind together this sort of federally devolved Iraq and protect it from interventionist neighbors, prevent it from breaking apart in large-scale civil war or from regional involvement. What do you feel about that? Or is that something that you think is realistic? Is that something you think is likely to happen? Or is that something that you also feel is an affront to Iraqi sovereignty and national dignity?
Well, I think there's a subtext to all of this. I mean, what are the objectives of the United States, apart from just maintaining stability and destroying Al-Qaeda in Iraq? I mean, is Iraq going to be part of the American security network in the Middle East? Is Iraq going to be a kind of surrogate frontline state against Iran? Is Iraq going to be locked up with the United States as some form of as it were, Western-oriented, Western-leaning, democratic beacon to countries in the neighborhood. All of these issues, I think, have to be looked at, really, and we have to see how does Iraq fit, and how should Iraq fit from the Iraqi point of view in all of these strategic plans and visions that are being spun for it in Washington and to a lesser extent in other Western capitals. I mean, I find myself now in a situation where the future of the country is being mapped out. The whole process is being worked out with very little Iraqi involvement. And this reminds me again, if one goes back to history, to the formation of the Iraqi state. The whole thing was mapped out by other powers, and there was a built-in instability as a result of these unilateral decisions taken, and a political class that owes its survival basically to its connections with the imperial power. So,
Phoebe, are you sanguine about the aftermath of a U.S. withdrawal? Are you alarmist about it? How do you see it? It seems inevitable that we will have a fairly significant withdrawal, if not before, then after the end of the Bush presidency. Well, how do you see the situation?
I am never certain what the United States is going to do, and I do find myself in considerable agreement with Ali on this. There hasn't really been any long-term thinking. Academics and others have come up with long-term plans, but basically the United States is reacting. We got ourselves into a terrible mess in Iraq, as we all know, and now we're saying, help, what do we do? There's certainly going to be a drawdown of the surge. How much our military can put in, how many resources we can put in, I think is a question. I think it's much harder to get out of these things than people think. But I don't think, frankly, from the United States point of view, whether it's the candidates running for election, we've got to help come up with some quick answer, or many people looking at what Iraq is going to do, where Iraqis are going to take Iraq. I don't think there has been enough hard thinking about what is U.S. interest. I mean, aside from Iraqi interest, and what sort of means and resources might we have to achieve them. So it's not only not clear to me exactly where Iraq is going to go, it's not entirely clear to me where the United States is going to go.
Dave, you have advised military and civilian leaders, and you may do so again. What are our interests in Iraq, and do we have the means to achieve them?
Right, I think this is. I'm very happy with the way this conversation is going, because we're asking the question, not like how many troops should we pull out and what months should they come out, which is just it's surface chatter. The issue is, what do we want Iraq to look like when it no longer has 160,000 US troops in it? And that is a question that can only be answered by Iraqis. So we have to work with the Iraqis and decide, how is this thing going to be structured? What's the end state? What are we trying to get to? And I think that if you were to map out our interests, I think you would say that they would include things like preventing an al-Qaeda safe haven in Iraq, a repeat of what happened in Pakistan and Afghanistan before 9/11. You would say that there was an interest in preventing a regional war, and we have to recognise that a civil war inside Iraq without us there wouldn't remain inside Iraq. It would draw in other powers, so there's an interest in preventing that. I think we need to think about the role of Iran in the region, and I don't characterise that as containment necessarily, because actually Iran is a very substantial power in that part of the world. It's the regime that we have an issue with, and for very good reason. So if anyone who went to the Columbia talk has a sense of that. So we've got to think about how Iran fits into that broader picture. I think we need to think about strategic resources, oil and gas, not in terms of extracting oil and gas from Iraq and bringing it to the United States, which actually doesn't happen, right? It's about the effect of instability in that Straits and Gulf region on the global economy and the global political system, particularly Northeast Asia, which gets the vast majority of its strategic resources from that area. So we've got to think about that. And I think the other thing, and perhaps the most important, and I'm putting this last, but I think it's actually the organising principle, is we have to think about restoring US authority, moral authority and credibility across the Arab and Muslim world and with the rest of the international community. And Because we're in a bigger war here, right? And no one's mentioned yet that this Iraq thing, it's a campaign in a much larger conflict with very large forces happening around the world. And we need that moral authority and credibility as ammunition in the fight against people like Osama bin Laden. So what we've got to do is kind of take a deep breath and think about what are we trying to achieve here. And I would suggest that Iraq is not going to look neat and tidy. It's going to be messy. It's going to probably get better on a security level. But then there are political questions that aren't even being asked now that will be raised as soon as it's secure enough to ask them. And then that's for the Iraqis to decide. It's not the 51st state, it's not a neo-colonialist project, so it's really up to them. And when the time comes for us to draw back and hand over to the Iraqis, we hand over. You know, that I think is going to be the hardest thing for people.
One more question, and then we'll go to you. John Lee, part of our moral authority, it seems to me, is how we have treated Iraqis who, in a sense, bought into our idea. And that includes those who've worked for the U.S. in Iraq, and even those who had simply identified philosophically with the idea of that was supposedly going to be the new Iraq, a secular, a democratic, a non-sectarian Iraq. What do we owe those people? And will there be any future, say 10 years from now, for them in Iraq? Or will they be under the rule of one militia or another that is going to either kill them or force them to leave the country? If that's the case, what do you think America can or should do?
Well, I mean, I entirely agree with you that, you know, America has a moral obligation to those people who it's worked for. God forbid we see images once again of helicopters leaving an embassy roof with an American embassy official punching employees, local employees of that embassy in the face. It was our final departure from Vietnam to get them to stop hanging on to the skids. You know, it was poignant actually, this issue, because a number of the interpreters that I got to know who work with the American Army and whom they are absolutely dependent on for their communication with the local people, authorities, and also for intelligence, spent all their time talking to me about, you know, the dangers that they faced, friends of theirs who'd already been killed, their hope in a couple of cases of getting visas to come to the States, and not comprehending the very bureaucratic and seemingly obstacle-filled path towards getting that visa. I think they need a 2-star general to sign off on their, to approve their visa, and few interpreters ever get to be in contact with a 2-star general, so it's a kind of a seemingly almost intentional catch-22, which hopefully will be facilitated. But, you know, in terms of those people who had hoped for a different Iraq, many have left. Many are now living in Amman. Those who had the means, the wherewithal, the visas, the money, are now in London or Amman or Syria or the Emirates. Many have left. The ones who still remain are people who are you know, dependent, have nowhere else to turn. Some actually still want it to work. A few of the interpreters I met were there out of sheer idealism. And some of them they go on, they're admirable people. Some of them are, have learned a great deal of English, about American culture, are fascinated by our country and what it portends, want it to work, but are very frightened about their position vis-a-vis the forces they're helping. It hasn't been fixed yet.
One thing we haven't talked about that I want to ask, or that maybe one of you will ask, especially Ali and Phoebe, is the regional consequences of this war and what the Iraq War is going to do over the next 10, 20, even 50 years to the map of the Middle East. But that's a big question that maybe we can get to as you ask yours. I can't see you at all because the house lights are down. Maybe the house lights could come up. Yeah, you're materializing now. So, line up at the mics.
Aye.
And, sir, you want to begin in the middle.
Right.
And make it a question, please, not a statement, and make it a fairly brief one so that we can get to a lot of you. Yes, sir.
When you talked about the fact that you have to leave it up to the Iraqis, which makes sense, it would seem to me, initially at least, that as far as the Iraqis are concerned, the Kurds in the north, we know that I think they would like their own nation, province, whatever you want to call it. In the south, the Shiites have their oil, the Kurds have their oil, and you have a middle area which has no oil. What would happen, and if the war went on, if there was a civil war, it would seem to me the Kurds would try to dissociate and the Shiites would win because they have twice the number of people and they have the oil. What if the Sunnis were to recognize that it's a no-win situation for them if there was civil war, and we were, instead of trying to figure out how you divide the oil, we were to have a kind of Marshall Plan for the middle, to try to put industry into the area that the Sunnis are in. So I'm assuming, what are the problems with having a Sunni in the middle, the Shiites in the south, the Kurds in the north, oil in the south, oil in the north?
Okay,
and
we got it. Phoebe.
Well, Ali may disagree somewhat with me, but this is the picture that keeps emerging of Iraq. And while it does have some validity, people's identities are multiple. And this intense sectarian difference between Shia and Sunni is something that has emerged in this stage to really drive the dynamics. But during other stages, if you had prosperity, if you had a government that delivered services, people might think about something else. I see Iraq as more complex. I see multiple differences among Shia and Sunnis, and I see them among Kurds as well. I doubt very much, however, that the quote-unquote Sunnis, from which much of this insurgency, the nesting of al-Qaeda and so on, has emerged, would simply sit back and say, okay, Kurds can take the oil in the north, Shia can take it in the south. I think one of the problems, as I've tried to say, is that we have a government with different kinds of political parties, and it's political parties with different interests and different constituencies that are driving this, have dispossessed a group which was mostly Sunni, and it's the outs who are fighting. I doubt very much that they would simply roll over and allow this. This is one of the reasons why we don't have stability, and this would certainly bring in the region as well. The Turks don't want an independent Kurdish state, and certainly we have the Saudis and others who would be very mindful of a quote-unquote Sunnistan, if it could exist, which was dispossessed of oil. But that's one view.
Ali, take a crack at it.
I mean, I tend to agree with you, Phoebe, is that it's true that, I mean, sectarianism is not the be-all and end-all of the Iraqi crisis, but it was an issue that was ignored for too long, and there was a sectarian basis to the former Iraqi state, not to the point where it completely alienated the Shia. I think what has happened in the last 18 months is that basically people have seen the abyss and have walked away from it. That particular identity, which may have been necessary to insist upon for a certain period of time in order to regain certain civil and community rights, is no longer the basis for creating a state. Because the Shias cannot possibly form a nation of their own, the Arab Shias, at least the Shias of Iraq can, because that brings up all kinds of other questions. How does that state relate to the other Arab Shias of Kuwait or of Lebanon and so on? And in spite of everything, there is this complex relationship between the Shias of Iraq, who are overwhelmingly Arab, and the issue of Iran. So to me, it's a highly improbable basis to form either a state of your own or to form a kind of region that has certain unique features to it that, for example, Kurdistan does.
Okay. Over here.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd like to just thank you all for a really informed discussion, which I don't think is typical of discussions about Iraq in other venues. And at the risk of perhaps sounding immoderate, I would just like to say that I've been struck from the build-up to the war, through the conduct of the invasion, and through the occupation, that the true motivation and interests of the American administration are not at all in line with the interests of the Iraqi people or the various power sources in Iraq, and that has been one of the main complicating factors in the occupation. So first I would like to know what your thoughts are about that statement, and if so, how to include that in the discussion of how we go forward from here.
Dave, you don't represent the administration, but you have worked with them. Are their interests opposed to Iraq's? Do they overlap in some places? What do you think?
Let me answer your question with a philosophical question. Are the Iraqis in the coalition or not? You know, we talk about coalition forces and Iraqi forces. We talk about the coalition and the Iraqi government. There's a sovereign government in Iraq who are working with, you know, the headquarters of the multinational force and the embassy to try and stabilise the situation. Of course, we don't necessarily believe that everyone in that government is doing a good job, and there are sectarian influences and so on, but it is a sovereign state. So I think it's a fundamentally different situation now than it was, say, in 04 or 05 under the interim government, or even under the Jafari government, because we're now in quite a different situation where the Iraqis are growing into a degree of greater sovereignty and exercise of power, and there's sort of a transition going on. I think the question of what our motivation was in invading Iraq is a fascinating historical debate, and that sounds glib, but you know, I work on the ground with people that get killed for making a wrong turn down the wrong alley. You know, what we've got to think about is what do we do next, and how do we and the Iraqis together, but primarily the Iraqis, work our way out of this situation. When General Petraeus asked me to come and work for him in Baghdad, the first question I asked was, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Right? Why are we doing the surge? Well, I understand what happens if we lose the war, but if we win, what do we get? And he said, you know, out of that discussion emerged the view that the purpose of the surge is to end the war. What we're trying to do here is stabilise it sufficiently that we can let the Iraqis take the running and we can step back. And that's, you know, that's not a popular point of view, but that's the purpose of it.
I'll get to you, but I want to ask you a personal question, Dave. You're not an American. You're not a career bureaucrat. Why did you go to work for the U.S. government in a war that has destroyed many a reputation and didn't seem like a winning proposition when you went earlier this year?
I was focusing, as you know, on Afghanistan for most of last year. I was working to try and defeat the so-called Spring Offensive, which fizzled pretty badly in the hands of some pretty incompetent Taliban leadership. And we were working hard in Afghanistan and actually not doing too badly. So it was a bit of not only a physical risk, but a reputational risk to go and work in Iraq. But General Petraeus asked me to go, and I had spent the last 3 years whining about the strategy and saying the strategy was wrong and we should be doing it differently and we should be taking a population-centric approach and partnering with the Iraqis and not doing this sort of heavy raiding stuff. And I spent, you know, basically 3 years whining about that, and then they said, come and help, we're adopting your strategy, come and help us implement it. I could hardly say, oh, good luck with that. You know, so, you know, I went not out of a sense that I thought we could win. I went out of a sense of personal obligation. Having said that, I'm pleasantly surprised to find that we are actually doing a lot better now that we're applying these methods. Does that mean that we're going to win? No. It's a sport. You know, it's two-sided. So we have to wait and see how it turns out.
Yes.
Are there any statements that have been made by the current major presidential candidates that you found particularly enlightened or reasonable or encouraging? And have there been any statements or positions taken by the current major candidates that you find particularly naive or disturbing?
That's a slow pitch. Who wants to take a swing?
Well, I can't vote here, so.
Then you're the man to talk about it.
No, I think the level of public dialogue or discourse of the major candidates is really quite shallow. It really doesn't go to the heart of the problem, and it's mainly to do with how the number of troops or the surge plays out in terms of domestic rivalries. But I think there are very, very few people in Washington within the major political candidates who've asked and tried to formulate answers to the deep questions. The only people who seem to think they know what they want are those who are already in power in the administration. And the question is that what are they going to do in the next 18 months in order to set American policy in Iraq in a way that may be irreversible for future presidential candidates or presidents. So I think that you have to really watch very, very carefully what are the steps being planned or implemented even over the next 18 months, so that future administrations are not saddled with a policy that's set as a result of an attempt to recapture, as it were, the basis of a failed policy as far as I'm concerned.
Ali, do Iraqis, including the politicians, care who's president? Someone once told me you will not find a single pro-Democrat among the Iraqi political class, that they all have essentially decided that whatever they think of Bush, he's the best they're going to do. Is that your experience?
I'm afraid so, because frankly, apart from the Kurds, it's highly improbable that any of the political leaders would have come to power were it not for the American intervention. They were way out on and I'm including myself here, way out on the fringes of Iraqi politics. And it would have been next to impossible for them to achieve power without the invasion and occupation. The fact that they came to power on the back of the United States invasion, I think, doesn't really work to their long-term advantage. That's why I think that as it were, the landscape of Iraqi politics will change drastically once the public stops being worried about how they're going to live from day to day. And once some form of a modicum of security and stability is established, some level of acceptable services, I think there will be an insurrection, political insurrection against the political class.
Let me just follow that up with something to Phoebe. Does that mean Muqtada al-Sadr will become even more powerful than he is now? Is he the guy who will inherit the grassroots resentment of the political class?
Oh, I don't know. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to again agree with Ali, and also to go back to Saddam's period, because I've been working on Iraq with 3 or 4 different, not with, but in government or out of it, 3 or 4 different administrations. There are no good solutions to Iraq from our perspective. And I think perhaps what I would listen for in the candidates is the degree of flexibility, open-mindedness, and my advice would be do no harm. Start by doing no harm. I don't know whether Muqtada or anyone else is quote-unquote going to inherit this at the grassroots. I know, as you said, that this is something people worry about. I think it's a complex situation. I think there's a jockeying and a struggle for power both within Baghdad and on the ground. And as with all political situations, we're going to have to see how it plays out. And certainly the United States, I think, is going to try to put its finger on the scale, not in favor of Muqtada.
Yes, right here.
So my question has to do partially with strategic resources, which were mentioned earlier. And I was wondering if someone could address because you have different experiences on the ground in Iraq, how the Iraqi populace sees United States business and corporate presence in Iraq, specifically privatization of Iraqi oil versus allowing large multinational US-based corporations to come in and benefit from the oil there, and secondarily with government spending in the United States and the money that has been contracted out to United States businesses that are rebuilding Iraq, and how the Iraqi populace perceives that.
John Lee, do you hear Halliburton come up in conversation very often?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an economist, but the Iraqis, and in fact American soldiers, are very aware of, and in fact privately, almost unanimously quite resentful of contractors. I recall being served in the Army mess last week, or week before last, by an American Army sergeant who, as he gave me my half-liter plastic water bottle flown in from the Emirates by KBR, subsidiary of Halliburton, said, "Well, Mr. John Lee, that's $8. Plastic plate with some food slopped on it, that's $30. And if you take this plate, why don't you, because it's a windy day, that's $60. And if you, this uniform every 3 days gets laundered, it costs $100. The wastage, the profiteering is mind-numbing. Everybody's aware of it. People know the figures, and not only in Iraq, in Afghanistan too. It's a I would say, a not insignificant source of social resentment that local indigenous businessmen and others have not been drawn in more to what is seen as a vast profiteering enterprise. There's, I think, a lot of frustration that the American presence, which is huge. You were saying, I think, Ali, I'm talking about 300,000 foreign nationals between American troops and contractors and Filipinos who are brought in. There's a whole kind of caste system of contractors and subcontractors and people with the bids. Very little of it seems to trickle into the local economy. There are certain powerful businessmen that have been favored. This is beginning to change now in small but hopefully substantive ways in the areas where they have these joint security stations where young captains are working together with an Iraqi counterpart, and they are in charge of, let's say, 20, 30, 50,000 civilians in an area, and they have a number of reconstruction projects that are quite identifiable, whether it's water treatment, street pavement, turning a field that was an ambush site into a soccer field, restoring electricity, substation, that kind of thing. And they are making a concerted effort to give those contracts to local businessmen and to employ people. But it's still, the bulk of the Western presence is sort of self-contained. A lot of the money never reaches the country.
Can I just jump in? The economic aspect of the surge is fundamental to what we're trying to do on the ground. And the embedded PRTs, which are now doing this work on the ground, are not like, some of you may have seen the PRTs in Afghanistan, which are sort of 150 or 200 people.
Provincial reconstruction teams.
Sorry, provincial reconstruction teams. In Iraq, you're looking at 8 to 16 people whose job is to go out and build local economic capacity in the community and to connect people to businesses and build that. And the people that are running those teams are essentially like train-the-trainer type people rather than delivering aid, if you like. And that is fundamental to what we're trying to do. It's also important to remember that the reason why we're spending so much money in Iraq is not solely because we're just big and corporate. It's a deliberate enemy tactic. Okay, there are 4 basic insurgent tactics that all insurgents use: provocation, intimidation of their own population, protraction, where they draw it out, and exhaustion, and exhaustion is what we're talking about here, where they try to impose costs on us that make it hard for us to do things and burden us and tire us out over time. We are currently spending, counting supplementals, $400 million a day in Iraq, okay? And is that because we're just profligate? No, I mean, that figure's on the record. It's because the environment, because of the way the enemy behaves, imposes that on us. Let me give you an example. If you want to drive across town and have a meeting with someone here, it might take you an hour and $20 in a cab to get there. I had a meeting in Iskandariyah recently with a local community leader. Got up before dawn, 4 hours of planning, two helicopters and an escort helicopter got shot at going in, lots of time wasted and fuel burnt trying to get to the ground. Ground move, more complicated, stuff to get you through the environment. 20-minute meeting, and you turn around and do it all again to get back. $10,000, $15,000 activity, 18 hours of work just for a 20-minute meeting. Not because we like to spend 18 hours running a 20-minute meeting, because the enemy's doing it to us. And that's why we moved off the FOBs, the forward operating bases, the big Halliburton-run areas, into these small joint security stations, which are like a local high school or a building where we have a couple of hundred guys and they're self-sustaining to a much higher degree than previously. And that then frees up a lot of the asset for the Iraqi people. Final point, and I'll stop talking. Us throwing lots of contract money to the Iraqi economy is not a sound way to conduct counterinsurgency. You end up with a development trap, like you see in any development activity, where the economy becomes dependent on US presence. So it is not necessarily punishing Iraqis that we don't give them contracts to work on bases. What we're actually trying to do is not build that dependency into the system, which we actually saw in Vietnam, as we all know, where it was very difficult for the South Vietnamese to survive without a very large US presence, because a lot of them drew their economic livelihood from that.
Yes.
So there's an upside to it as well.
Speaking of bases, my question is about this somewhat mystifying concept of sovereignty. It's been thrown around this evening quite a lot in terms of, on the one hand, it seems everybody can agree that Iraqis want to have sovereignty, and ultimately it's in American interest for Iraq to have sovereignty. On the other hand, Mr. Allawi gave us fantastic examples of how the concept gets, holds a rather large devil in the details. Many claim that Iraq has a sovereign government at the moment, but his examples clearly demonstrate that it's not the case, or at least from the perspective of many Iraqis, it's not the case.
So the question, because we're running short of time.
Is it possible, in light of the number of permanent bases, enduring bases, whatever you want to call it, that the United States has constructed in Iraq, that Iraq can have sovereignty?
Ali?
Iraq has sovereignty. It's a sovereign country. It's been sovereign since the 30th of June.
I don't believe it.
Hey,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
if you don't mind,
I'm sorry. There's a factual error here. Okay. The relationship between the Iraqi government and the security forces is governed by a United Nations Security Council resolution, which lays out the processes by which these things occur.
There is legal sovereignty, but is there a spirit of sovereignty?
No, I mean, even legal sovereignty is in dispute here, because I'll give you an example. I mean, according to the Iraqi constitution, the commander-in-chief of the Iraqi army is the prime minister. I know a specific case, I'm sure David will confirm that, where he gave an order to a general, to an Iraqi general, to do something, and that general was then arrested by the head of the multinational force because it contravened their military policy. Sovereignty is a very flexible word. Technically, yes, Iraq is a sovereign country and was so in June 30th, 2004. But in reality, it's not. And there are 101 ways in which this issue of sovereignty is in fact depleted of its content. One way is what I would call agenda setting. The Iraqi government is simply not competent in terms of its administrative capability of running the state. It is incapable of formulating its own policies, at least this political group. And it is incapable of working on a medium and long-term plan for anything. There's an army of consultants out there, both in the civilian area and in the security area, that set the agenda. And it is impossible to work outside of that framework. We are not able, we're not allowed or authorized to conduct yourself in ways that gives you not only the form but the substance of a sovereign independent country. Now there's a lot of structural weaknesses in the country that may justify this state of affairs. But in reality, it is the agenda setting, It is the way the discrepancy of resources that are available to the United States and to the Iraqi government is just completely out of whack. The kind of money that's being spent in Iraq is inconceivable in terms of Iraq's experience. I mean, these billions and billions of dollars that have gone in there. Huge amount of waste. David talks about the reconstruction teams now. What happened to the Marshall Plan of 2003, where the United States actually expended $20 billion on a Marshall Plan for Iraq, of which there is very, very little to show for it. The United States has spent in Iraq on a per capita basis more than it has had in real terms on countries after World War II. In post-war reconstruction in Germany, on a per capita basis, more money was spent in Iraq. There's nothing to show for it. The discrepancy of resources, the discrepancy of power, the discrepancy in terms of skills and competences, and just the sheer weight of the foreign military presence and civilian presence makes Iraq a non-sovereign country in matters of substance.
And there has been, I would add, there's been enough corruption on both the Iraqi and American side to go around. Let's do 2 more questions. That's all we have time for. Yes?
Why do you think it took so long for our military leadership to realize just how counterproductive the damage that they were doing in rifling through the haystack, using the language from earlier, in search of those needles? And it seems, and to what extent are they actually changing their strategy now? And also, I think this question is relevant, even though it's backward-looking instead of forward-looking, because I think the onus is on us to prove that the forces that were at work then that made this disconnect between our military strategy and the political consequences on the ground are not still in place and won't be in the future.
Dave, that one seems for you.
Oh, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why it took a long time. One of those is that the US military is extremely big, and it takes a long time for ideas to filter down to sort of the lower level where actual contact with the population occurs, so there's a change in the environment. I think also we have repeatedly been slow in understanding changes in the environment and then reacting to those. So I think that's kind of the reason why it took us a little while. I think it is easy to look at the news and see sort of a senseless parade of mayhem happening in Iraq, but actually there is I think a qualitative change, and John Lee might have a view on this as well. There's a qualitative change in the way that the majority of operations are being conducted. And so I think, you know, we're not there yet, but I think we now have a force that's actually broadly aligned to the environment. Now, what happens next with that depends on a whole lot of other factors outside American control. So our bit of it is sort of that big, and it's going better than it was, but there's still a lot of other parts to the picture.
Speaking sort of in private, I spoke with a number of officers from fairly senior on down, and there's a kind of new pragmatism. There's not a kind of ideological tint that I could detect to the officer class in the field now, some of whom were new, some of whom had been there earlier. One quite senior officer in particular, in a circumspect way, wanted me to know that he had felt sort of handcuffed by political decisions taken earlier, and that he was quite happy with the new writ he had now. He felt much more capable of confronting the issues, the crisis, as it were, with a combination of, as they call it, kinetic and non-kinetic policy. You have to get around the jargon sometimes to actually figure out what they're talking about. But, that Rumsfeld was in office, and I think once Rumsfeld went, I mean, you can see a kind of new malleability, a new flexibility, frankly, a less ideological Pentagon gradually kicking into gear in Iraq.
Last question.
In 13 months' time, we'll know who the next American president will be. Is that a moment when something could or will change? And if you were advising that president-elect during the transition, and any one of you, including Mr. Packard, could answer, what would the one thing you'd want to impress on that transition team be?
Thanks. That's one of the questions that I had that I didn't get to. Phoebe, you are Clinton's Iraq advisor. You are Romney's Iraq advisor. It is November 2008. Your person has just been elected. What do you tell them?
That's why I'm an academic. Believe me, it's, I would certainly, having been one of the expert members of the Iraq study group, I incline in that direction. I believe in realism, and I think certainly we ought to be about a gradual withdrawal from Iraq. I know a lot of people want to get out soon. Of course, this is the next administration. I recognize we will have drawn down some. A precipitous withdrawal is, I think, going to be disastrous, because I don't think whichever Iraqis you're talking about, the central government, the military, local government, except for militias here and there that we don't particularly like, it's going to be very difficult to get the kind of security I feel a little less confident about, frankly, when we withdraw. But ultimately, we have to get out. Whatever that ultimately is, and thinking about how to do that, thinking about what is U.S. interest in the region and in Iraq, and working in conjunction with the Iraqis is going to be absolutely essential. This idea, at least to my mind, that it's going to be North Korea and we're going to have some kind of presence there for some long term, I just don't think is in the cards as far as the Americans are concerned. And in any event, that's up to the Iraqis. That's up to the Iraqis if they would like some kind of presence there.
I think it's possible that you will find yourself an advisor in a Clinton administration or a Romney administration or an Obama administration, being an Australian and nonpartisan. What would you tell that president or that president's Secretary of State?
Well, I think I would probably tell the incoming president the same thing that we've all in the counterinsurgency community been telling the current administration, which is listen to the Iraqis. Okay, it's their country. Imagine the Iraqi police came to Los Angeles or New York City and tried to police the city. Imagine how much trouble they'd have. You know, we've got to work with the local population. We've got to partner with everybody from the government down to local communities, and only when we get to that point will we be in a position to actually conduct this thing effectively. So we've got to listen to what the Iraqis want. And I think one of the problems we've had all along is we thought that these decisions were ours to make, and we thought, you know, what do we want in Iraq and what do we want? It's much more complicated than that. We've surrendered control over a lot of the levers that we would need to move if we wanted to make the thing look like we want it to look. So we just got to, you know, realise that when we're no longer in control, we're not in control. The Iraqis are in control.
I want to thank the panel for more light than heat, which is how it should be. And thank you all for coming.
This event was part of this year's New Yorker Festival. For more information, visit festival.newyorker.com.